Hello everybody, welcome to week 10 of the course. We're officially 2/3 of the way through the semester, so we're heading down the home stretch. First I wanted to make a couple of announcements. First, my apologies about the quiz last week and the technical difficulties that I had with that. I tried to, because I'm teaching this class in person as well, so I tried to import that quiz into Canvas, and for some reason it got lost in the ether, and I didn't notice it until Sunday morning. I didn't check my email on Saturday. So anyway, I apologize for that. And I've posted the updated quiz. Quiz 3, I posted it yesterday. And you guys, rather than it being due this past Saturday, it's now due this coming Saturday, November 1st. Once again, same principles apply. It's open book, so you can use your notes, the readings, things like that. Second thing is that because we're getting close to time, just keep in mind that your final papers are going to be due in about a month, a little bit over a month. So definitely start thinking about those. If you guys have questions about questions about their topics and whether it's a good topic or not, or if you have a topic but you're trying to find resources, yeah, let me know. Shoot me an email. I'm happy to work with you on that. Also, something to note is that next week is Election Day, next Tuesday. So hopefully you guys have been inspired by these discussions on civic engagement to get out and vote. We're going into, this week marks the fourth section of the course, which is talking about government institutions. This week we're going to be looking at the president as an institution, and we're talking about, when we talk about the institutions of government, we're talking about the executive branch, judicial branch, legislative branch, and we're talking about a fourth institution that's sort of sprung up gradually through the years, but mainly started in the Roosevelt administration, FDR, the Washington bureaucracy, and that's when the executive branch started taking on more power, and all of these government agencies started sprouting up. So we're gonna talk about the bureaucracy as well. Anyway, last week we were looking at civic engagement, and this notion of civic engagement, it can be a confusing one. And I had, people were curious about, looking at the Putnam and the Verba, whether civic engagement and political engagement are the same things. And oftentimes the words are used interchangeably. But I would argue that there is a slight distinction between the two. Civic engagement is a bit more broad than political engagement. Political participation is a part of civic engagement. So the word civic, if you go back to its original, I think it was in Latin, its original word, it meant pertaining to the local town or city. So usually it's more focused on a community level, on a local level. But of course we've expanded the term to apply to the national level as well, or even the international level. So civic engagement can be anything like volunteering at a local homeless shelter. It could be helping out your neighbor potentially. And of course things like political participation are included under civic engagement. So voting is considered civic participation. Contacting your local official, contacting the newspaper about a political matter. Yeah, so those forms of political participation do count as civic participation, but I don't think the terms are mutually exclusive. I think that civic engagement is a bit more comprehensive than political participation. So I just wanted to start with that distinction between those two terms. And when Verba's talking more about political participation. He's talking about political voice in particular, right? People's ability to communicate through their engagement to their officials. Political voice is the mechanism that people use to convey, their wishes and preferences to elected representatives in a democracy. So political voice is an important term to understand. But anyway, going back to Putnam, Putnam was exploring this sort of disappearance, the sudden disappearance of civic engagement in American life. And he sort of starts it out as like a type of detective story, right? You know, why is it the case that civic engagement has mysteriously declined in America? And, you know, he examines several possibilities, right? I mean, so he starts off by saying, you know, in the 50s, right, that's sort of the golden era of civic engagement where people were participating in, you know, like local associations like the Elks Club or the Auxiliary Club. People were belonged to bowling leagues together, and they were spending all this time together, and sort of this, you know, people think of it as like this golden age, sort of Leave It to Beaver kind of America. When we often think, at least our generation or my generation, because I'm a little older than you guys, when we think of like, you know, Americana, right? We think about, you know, think about these days of people, you know, bowling together and going to these cookouts together and all this sort of stuff. Whereas now we tend to be much more isolated, right? We're sitting in our houses watching TV. We're sitting in front of our computers, like I'm doing right now, and I spend probably the majority of my day doing, if I'm not sleeping the majority of my day. So, which I'm not sleeping the majority of my day these days. I'm pretty busy. But yeah, social media. So not just, you know, and of course that's the thing, right? Like with the, you know, like cell phones and smartphones and things like that. Even when we're out of the house, we're in front of a screen, right? It's shocking to see. Like I was out at dinner the other night, and there were these 4 people sitting around a table, you know, having dinner. And all 4 of them were looking at none of them were looking at each other. They looked at their phone the entire time. So it's just kind of weird in a way. But anyway, right? So this golden generation in the 50s of, you know, civic engagement, and Putnam says, you know, over time, that's just fallen off, right? We don't do that stuff anymore. And Putnam thinks that has sort of profound consequences for democracy. And, you know, there's several reasons. One, and this is something somebody mentioned in the comments, is that, you know, the political voice, the people's voice, if they're not engaging, their voice is not being heard, which is true. But Putnam says that he believes that when you associate in different groups and things like that, something called social capital is created. And he argues that social capital is sort of the glue that holds democracies together, right? So take, for instance, this idea of people belonging to a bowling league. You know, every Wednesday you get together with the same group of people, you know, and you bowl. But not only do you bowl, I mean, you talk about what's going on in your community. You talk about what's going on nationally. You know, you sort of hear, you know, because, you know, there's probably diversity of views in your group, so you hear sort of different views, and maybe you can put a face with, you know, the opposing party, right, Democrat or Republican or whatever, different position. The idea is that you have a much better understanding of the way politics actually works and your community actually works if you're interacting with somebody on a, you know, a face-to-face basis, rather than getting, you know, the opposing position through Fox News or MSNBC, you know, where they're essentially sensationalizing and demonizing the other view. At least you're getting some context when you're in this bowling league, because your buddy Bob, you know, believes that assault weapons should be banned, and you believe that that infringes on the Second Amendment, but at least you can put it in some sort of context, you know. And it also, Putnam says, teaches us how to, by engaging in these different associations, it teaches us how to be more involved in the political process, right? The same skills that we need to engage in the political process are the same skills that we're utilizing when we're part of a group, right? We're part of an organization. So Putnam thinks it's important, and he argues that, you know, that capacity, our social capital, has greatly declined over the past, you know, 50 years, the past couple of generations. And he looks at several reasons, you know, why this might be the case. One reason is that people always complain that we're so busy, right? But the studies don't actually support that. People are, you know, at least self-reporting, people are not claiming to be more busy or working more hours now than they were in the 50s. So he rules that out. The other option was, you know, people are more moving around more, you know, more transient, right? And the idea is, well, if you're moving around every 5 years or so, you're not going to have the same connections that you have if you spend your entire life somewhere and you get to know this group and you spend time with them, which seems plausible on the face of it. But people are actually moving around less right now than they were in the 50s. So once again, you know, not the case, right? So then he starts to look at it from a generational perspective, and he says, I mean, if you look, like the greatest generation, I guess they're called, the silent generation sometimes, they're the ones who were, engaged. They're the ones who were sort of adults in this golden age of civic engagement. And ever since, when, the baby boomers came along, or Generation X, or now the millennials, it's just been a steady decrease in levels of civic engagement. So he sees it as a generational thing, but he's trying to pinpoint exactly what the factors are, right? And he says that there is a conflicting piece of this too. Like the only factor that is really tied closely into civic engagement, or as far as correlates to it, or maybe even has some sort of causal relationship, is education. Higher levels of education are usually correspond to higher levels of civic engagement. So herein lies a riddle, right? Because levels of education have been increasing since the greatest generation. Our generation, as far as like higher education goes, has higher levels. So why would it be the case that if more education leads to more engagement, why would it be the case that as we're becoming more educated, we're actually becoming less engaged, right? So this is sort of a riddle. And Putnam's conclusion, which probably comes to the surprise of nobody, I mean, we know it, right? But maybe we don't fully realize the impact that it has, is he points to television, right? He says that, in 1959, 10% of households had TVs when, this engagement thing was at its highest levels. 10 years later, 90% of households had TVs, and engagement had already started to decline. So, and it's just gradually increased. Americans are spending more and more time watching TV. So, and he says, it's the one technology, right, that tends to isolate us. He points to newspapers and says that people who read newspapers, readers versus viewers, he calls them, readers tend to be engaged at much higher levels. There's actually a higher correlation between being a reader and engaging than people who don't read. Whereas if you're a viewer watching TV, you're much less likely to engage. So whether it's a time thing or the message that you're receiving through the TV, or there's this book that came out probably about 10 years ago called Amusing Ourselves to Death, which essentially is making the same argument that Putnam is making, that it's technology. And of course, the question is, has it gotten better or worse since technology, in a lot of ways, has been supplanted by the internet and social media? So, and a lot of people brought this up in their discussions, and I think it's a really interesting point, right, that social media has the potential to increase levels of civic engagement by providing us with new avenues of civic engagement. I mean, sure, you're not associating with people at the bowling league, but maybe you have this group that you belong to on Facebook. But there have been studies that have been done, even though that, media has the potential to do that. There have been several studies that have been done that have said that, people who spend a certain amount of time on Facebook actually feel more isolated than people who don't, right? So it actually makes you feel more depressed. Even though you tend to be connecting in a certain way, it doesn't have the same effect. Maybe that's evolutionary because, we've evolved in such a way that when we're part of a group, we're part of a group. We have these chemicals that are released or whatever that make us these feel-good chemicals, and we don't get that when we're sitting in front of our computer screen, even if we're chatting with another person, right? Another thing too is that that whole idea of like nonverbal communication versus verbal communication, right? And they say that 75% of the information that we get actually comes nonverbally. You don't get that through social media, so you don't pick up on those physical cues, and you don't get the context, right? You don't get the environmental context. So there's something different that's happening when you're engaging in bowling leagues or associations or whatever. Something different's happening, right? So I think social media has a lot of potential to do that, but I don't think that it can replace that kind of person-to-person interaction. Okay, so that's Putnam. And the second one was Verba, right? So Verba says not only is it the case, it's important to know that civic engagement is in decline. He agrees with Putnam, and he kind of was following off Putnam's study. And he says, but also it's important to realize that the people who are participating, it's very unequal, right? So the people that are participating, it's not just the case that less people are participating, but rather the people who are participating are the affluent in society, right? So the majority of the people, the 99%, I guess we could say, are not participating, and the wealthy are the ones that are participating. And he says that this started to happen when money replaced time as the #1 political currency. It used to be that people would go out and volunteer, to work for campaigns, be engaged in their communities, things like that. Now he says it's much more likely that if people are going to participate in politics, they're going to do it by giving money, right? That's the thing that has increased by, I think he said, 20 or 30 times in the past 30 or 40 years, right? The amount of donations that Americans have been giving to political campaigns. Interestingly, he talks about how we rank as far as voting rates go, and he references this particular study. And it turns out, if you had to guess, what would you think that where Americans rate in elections? The study that he references has to do with parliamentary elections. Countries around the world that actually have parliamentary elections. What is the rate that people in that country participate in those elections? I think America was around 59%. Well, it turns out that puts us in 120th place around the world. It goes back to that video I pointed out in the beginning, the newsroom clip, right, where he's talking about what is America the best country in the world in? Certainly not voting, right, because we're in 120th place behind the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Ukraine, and Iran. Even though Iran's only had one election, parliamentary election, their rates are much higher than ours. So we're not ahead in that way, right? But he says, well, but yeah, we in these other civic engagement ways, we do tend to be more involved. But what that civic engagement looks like now is giving money. And he says once the political currency becomes giving money versus giving your time, the playing field is no longer equal, right? And he talks about this is where this notion of political voice comes in, right? If you're donating your money to particular causes, or if you are civically engaging rather than just giving money, you're going to be pushing forward your own interests, your own agendas. And as we already saw, there's this great correlation between higher levels of education, which is usually tied into socioeconomic status, and higher levels of engagement. And then he draws this distinction. He says, look, when the people who are disadvantaged do participate, they say very different things than the people who are normally participating. The poor are much more interested in basic human needs, poverty, health care, things like that. When you're talking to the wealthy or the affluent, the things that they're interested in are taxes, the federal budget, and government spending. Those were the three things that the people who were donating money were most interested in. And of course, those are the things that benefit them the most, right? They want to make sure that the wealth that they have is being protected and is not being encroached upon. The ironic thing is that these two needs these two interests are diametrically opposed, right? Because in order to provide, for the basic human needs from a governmental level, you have to have governmental programs in place, like welfare or Obamacare, right, to provide for these. But of course, to do that, you're going to have to raise taxes. You're going to go into greater debt to do that. So it becomes a question of what you believe the role of government should be, right? The wealthy believe that it should be protecting their funds. The poor believe that it should be, supporting basic human needs. So, that's a great debate in American society. What should the role of government actually be? But the fact of the matter is that currently our elected officials are only hearing primarily hearing from the affluent, right? So they're really only getting one side of the story. And Verba asks, what's the solution? Is it workers of the world unite, right? The unions, the old communist slogan, we come together and to have strength in numbers. He said, well, that's unlikely because the people that are joining these organizations are the people who are already wealthy. Right, so the people who actually need it are not the ones who are joining these organizations. And he says the only hope may be religious organizations because he says these people who are, lacking in resources and lacking in political capital are much more likely to be in church than they are to be in a labor union. And you can get some of the same skills and some of the same resources from participating in a religious organization as you can participating in a labor union. So Verba argues that may be the particular solution, but this income inequality that we have has led to this great political inequality now. And the scary thing is that the income inequality is only growing, right? There was a study, or there was a talk show today. I don't know if you ever heard it. It's Diane Rehm. She does something on NPR, and it was very interesting talking about income inequality. I think currently the rates are the average CEO makes 600 to 800 times more than their lowest employee, 360 times more than the average employee. So the income inequality is only growing, and the consequences of that for democracy, especially when political participation is only measured by our checkbooks, right, which it is increasingly so, is leading us into some dire circumstances. Okay, so this week, talking about the president, we're going to be looking at Federalist Paper number 70, where Alexander Hamilton argues quite energetically, you might say, for the executive branch for a president, which of course, coming out of the monarchy and the British rule, some of the founders were very skeptical of. Hamilton was sort of the champion of the presidency. And then we're going to look at a paper by Stephen Stark talking about the postmodern presidency and how the presidency has changed, he's talking about in the advent of the media and being able to reach the voters directly. Anyway, don't forget about Quiz 3. It is available. It will be available until Saturday at midnight. You guys are allowed to use your books. And if you have questions about the final paper, please let me know. Have a good week.